To me, pretty big deal. I've never seen this around any court that I've ever been involved with, where there's this much dark money and this much influence being used. Here's how the Washington Post summed it up. This is a conservative activist behind-the-scenes campaign to remake the nation's courts, and it's a $250 million dark money operation. $250 million is a lot of money to spend if you're not getting anything for it. So that raises the question, what are they getting for it? Well, I showed the slide earlier on the Affordable Care Act and on Obergefell and on Roe versus Wade. That's where they lost. But with another judge, that could change. That's where the contest is. That's where the Republican Party platform tells us to look at how they want judges to rule, to reverse Roe, to reverse the Obamacare cases, and to reverse Obergefell and take away gay marriage. That is their stated objective and plan. Why not take them at their word? But there's another piece of it, and that is not what's ahead of us, but what's behind us. What's behind us is now 80 cases, Mr. Chairman, 80 cases under Chief Justice Roberts that have these characteristics. One, they were decided 5-4 by a bare majority. Two, the 5-4 majority was partisan in the sense that not one Democratic appointee joined the five. I refer to that group as the Roberts Five. It changes a little bit, as with Justice Scalia's death, for instance, but there's been a steady Roberts Five that has delivered now 80 of these decisions. And the last characteristic of them is that there is an identifiable Republican donor interest in those cases. And in every single case, that donor interest won. It was an 80-0, 5-4 partisan rout, ransacking.
I'm Sarah Kendzior, the author of the best-selling books, The View from Flyover Country and Hiding in Plain Sight.
I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller, Mr. Jones.
And this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption in the Trump administration and rising autocracy around the world. So last week, I took a few days off, which is roughly a century in Trump time. So Andrea is going to be leading the discussion today on current events from the last week, and she has a lot to say. But one thing about going offline for a few days is that it gives you clarity on some of the big picture issues that are often played down or ignored, not because they're not important, but because they are so horrific and so consistent and have gone on for so long with no meaningful pushback that Americans have either accepted them or are so paralyzed and frightened by the lack of accountability that they just don't want to think about them at all. But you need to. As I wrote back in 2016, you need to keep track of how expectations change over time in an emerging autocracy, and you need to keep your original expectations intact, even if you do not think they will be met. So here's a quick refresher on what Trump has been up to when I finally checked the news again yesterday after a few days off. Trump is still threatening to jail his opponent, Joe Biden, his opponent's family, Hunter Biden, his predecessor, Barack Obama,
Projection.
and his former presidential opponent, Hillary Clinton. Trump is the first U.S. president to ever threaten any of those actions. And yes, Trump's rise was made possible due to pre-existing institutional failures. And yes, he builds on a long history of corruption in U.S. government. But the U.S. has never had anything approaching this situation. We have never had such a fundamental abuse of power and threats of violence against political rivals from the executive branch, because that is what dictators do. Sometimes it's not even what dictators do because it's too fucking obvious. And those dictators fear pushback from citizens or the courts or political opponents or from international observers. But not here in the USA. The world's last superpower is on the road to becoming the world's first super dictatorship. In addition to his unprecedented threats to incarcerate his political rivals on baseless grounds, Trump is the first president to encourage Americans to vote illegally, both so he can win illegally and so he can contest the legitimacy of the vote if he loses. He is the first president to order the destruction of election infrastructure, in this case, the United States Postal Service. He is the first president to be impeached for soliciting illegal election assistance from a foreign state, the first who has continued to solicit illegal assistance from hostile foreign states, the first who received assistance from a hostile foreign state to win the previous election in 2016, which should have led to his timely removal, but nobody would actually act on that. And the first president to pressure a foreign leader to get dirt on the aforementioned current rival, Joe Biden, that he seeks to imprison. Trump is also the first president who has said he will contest the election results if he doesn't win, the first who has threatened to postpone the election, the first who has said he should serve 3 terms instead of the constitutionally mandated 2 terms. He is spelling out dictatorship in the most obvious way possible, and folks are just kind of treating it like those are the daily headlines because he's been doing it for 4 years, but that is how dictatorships emerge. Andrea, I know you have thoughts on this.
Lots and lots and lots of thoughts. So I wanted to add to that by preparing everyone for a crash landing this November. What we have to remember, given everything that Sarah just outlined, it's at the heart of it, it's normalization. It's normalization, right? American democracy is the proverbial frog in a pot of boiling water that slowly comes hotter, hotter, hotter. We're boiling right now. Because of this normalization and all the institutional failure and corruption and greed that got us Trump in the first place, I want everybody to emotionally prepare themselves now and accept the fact that Donald Trump and the Trump crime family could very well, quote unquote, win this election.
Be reinstalled
yeah.
in this election.
Yeah, exactly. So prepare yourself for that. Prepare yourself for that. I know that there's a lot of polls that are giving people a false and harmful sense of cautious optimism, but the reality remains that the Republican Party has made it a core of their existence to engineer the stealing of elections and engineer a takeover of information spaces. And I'm going to go through some of that now. So this is what we're up against. It's this disinformation virus. You have big tech, which has been profiting off of the slush fund of Republican and Kremlin disinformation, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Google. This is all run amok. This has given birth to the monster of QAnon, which the Republicans are now actively weaponizing, including in the Hunter Biden nonsense. You had Senator Ron Johnson, who surprisingly won his election in Wisconsin as senator of Wisconsin. People expected him to lose in 2016. The election security advocate, Jennifer Cohn, has pointed to that and how there were some strange patterns in the vote for Johnson in Wisconsin. And then Johnson goes and takes a trip to Moscow for 4th of July. That's a very symbolic kiss the ring gesture to Putin. And since then, Johnson has been a reliable disinformation weapon for the Kremlin. He's been pushing that in Congress, trying to investigate the investigators of Trump's Russia corruption and going after people like my sister, Alexandra Chalupa, the consultant for the DNC, who warned both Democrats and Republicans that Russia was attacking our democracy in 2016 and that Paul Manafort running Trump's campaign was proof of that. Ron Johnson has gone after her. And now he's on TV saying that Hunter Biden had pedophile videos on his computer. They're weaponizing that whole QAnon. QAnon, that cult, is how they're going to drive out their voters. And it's big tech. It's big tech that has profited from all of that. And whatever they're doing now is just a little too late. Then you have hedge funds that have been destroying newsrooms across America, gobbling up all of these legacy newspapers and local broadcast networks and so forth, and laying people off. And some of the first units to go are the investigative units, because investigative journalism is costly, it's time intensive, it's resources intensive. And so for a hedge fund, it's not profitable. So that's been weakening us over the years. And then you have this consolidation of far-right media like Murdoch's Fox News and the New York Post, which ran that shoddy, shady, weird Hunter Biden hit piece. Fox News didn't want to touch it, but the New York Post did. Sinclair Local TV Broadcasting now owns or operates around 300 TV stations across the US. Sinclair being a staunch Putin-like disinformation arm of the Republican Party. You have One America as well, and of course all these troll bots. Cambridge Analytica, we all remember them, the militarized propaganda firm that helped tilt the scales of both Brexit and the 2016 election. They, of course, illegally stole Facebook data from 87 million Facebook users who were then bombarded with messaging to help Trump win. They were central to Mueller's report, including how the CEO of Cambridge Analytica tried to get Hillary's emails, the so-called, hacked Hillary's emails from the Kremlin tool WikiLeaks. There have been many reports that former Cambridge Analytica employees are now working for the Trump campaign, employing those dark arts that have worked so well for them in the past. And you have the President of the United States himself as a disinformation machine. The 2020 US presidential election is going to come down to this disinformation virus. That is what can very well tip the scales, along with hard-fought vote suppression by the Republican Party. And then added to that, ongoing Russian hacking attempts. However, they're going to be successful. But we're not going to know if the Russian hacking attempts are successful because the officials in charge don't like to tell us about this. They refuse to be transparent about these attacks on our political infrastructure. So all of these factors combined could very well tip this election to the Trump crime family. It would, of course, be a stolen election. It would be another illegitimate election. And it would be, of course, an ongoing constitutional crisis. So we're calling on all of you to prepare yourselves for that now, because as we keep saying on the show, the war is in the mind. They're trying so hard to demoralize us and take away our hope. And the more prepared you are for the reality up ahead, the faster you will react and show up where you're needed and take actions that are needed. And this is really to inoculate you to the worst happening. We are the ones that warned Robert Mueller will not save you. I was the one that predicted Comey was going to be fired. We've been telling you from the beginning that Ivanka Trump is next for president. And that's the end game of this, because they want to keep this dynastic kleptocracy in power to enrich themselves and avoid accountability. So we're the ones that have been warning you of all of these quote unquote crazy things since the very beginning. And they've been proven correct. So now please prepare yourself that all of these rosy polls are going to be shown to not factor in how desperately weakened our institutions have been all this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we've seen over the last few weeks record voting turnout, record voter registration, people waiting, 11 hours in line in some states to vote, which in itself is a very depressing thing. That's a sign of voter suppression, or at least attempted voter suppression. But you're seeing people being incredibly determined, incredibly resolute, expressing their desire to vote and their determination to get the Trump crime family out of office. And so, this all speaks to the fact that this was never a both sides situation. This was never a 50-50 American situation, or even, they like to say 45% of Americans support Trump. I have always felt, and I say this from Missouri, a state that did vote for Trump, that the number of supporters he has was small starting out and has dwindled since. The ones who remain tend to be more fanatical, which is a problem in and of itself. And that from the beginning, any Democrat who runs against Trump in a free and fair election would beat him. And that, of course, includes Joe Biden. And so the question was never, will the Democrats beat this president who is less popular than any president in the history of our country? The answer is very likely yes. The question is, will the election be free and fair? And then secondarily, if Biden does win, for example, in the landslide, will Trump concede, or will he contest it and then go to the courts, which Mitch McConnell and others have worked to carefully pack before Trump arrived, with Merrick Garland and other situations like that. But of course, have gone into overdrive recently after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg? And will we have a repeat of Bush versus Gore, only on much more dangerous grounds, where they're just outright saying they do not want the US to be a representative democracy? They don't want it to be a democracy at all. Like, we had Senator Mike Lee saying that outright. And so all of the agendas of the Republican Party that they used to try to gloss over with patriotism or with constitutional rhetoric, that illusion will be gone. They are going to be openly criminal, openly autocratic. They already are to some extent, but I think it's going to go into turbo drive. And so we just have to be prepared for any possible outcome. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that there is a Biden landslide and that they get out and that they're held accountable for their crimes. But you need a plan for, well, what if he stays in? And as we've said before, the plan is not to then flee the country. The plan is not to throw your hands up in despair and cry. The plan is then, well, how do we remove him? And then it depends on, the balance of the House and the Senate, which is why it's another reason it's very important that you vote, and that you vote Democratic down the ticket. It's important that we, in the future, try to replace some of our weak Democratic, quote unquote, leaders, people like Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, all of these people who have been incredibly ineffective at battling the Trump crime cult and have in fact enabled it and are doing nothing to stop this erosion of democracy. We can replace them with young, good, determined, pro-democracy leaders, people like Katie Porter or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There's a lot of potential to turn this situation around. It's just going to feel like hell. I mean, it's just going to be a slog through absolute misery and hell, because we're in a war. We're in a war with our own government, led by a Kremlin asset, at war with his own people, using any means possible, using a pandemic against his own people, and we're not, I don't even want to use that phrase, because we're not his people. We are Americans, and this is our country, and we've basically been hijacked from within. And that's part of the pain of this situation, is realizing that all of these institutions that are designed to protect us from foreign threats, that are being fed by our tax money to serve us, are being used to kill us. And that's not like a metaphor or an exaggeration. That is a literal statement of fact. And we'll get into, what's new with the coronavirus later in the show. But yeah, you need to kind of look at what the worst case scenario could be, which of course is another term of Trump, and then think, well, what are you going to do in that scenario? And what mechanisms are at our disposal? And what kind of leverage do we have? And think about things like protest, and think about things like what kind of power your local officials hold, and also about documenting all of that. Because one thing I do see coming around the bend, and this is something that would, almost definitely happen under a Trump second term, but may just happen as a result of the demise of media, the rise of social media monopolies as an even more kind of all-encompassing force, is we may lose our freedom of speech. We may lose our ability to document things digitally. We may lose access to digital archives. So no matter what happens, write down what you see going around you, keep records, be a vigilant citizen, be an engaged citizen. I know everybody is tired. Andrea and I are both very, very tired. We've been having this discussion for 5 years, but the next few months are going to be very critical, chaotic, but critical. So, please try your best to do everything you can to preserve our democracy as a whole, to preserve the United States. Don't let it fall apart. Don't surrender. Don't give in.
And with all of this said, understand that there are millions of people who are showing up to vote and volunteering and fighting like hell to prevent this outcome. And so just know that you're not alone. None of us are alone. We're all connected with a larger force for good in this world. So please have confidence in that. And one thing that you must do to stand up to normalization and to refuse to be demoralized is to claim your power, stand in your power. And the way you need to do that now is to get out the vote. We have here on Gaslit Nation the Save Democracy Challenge, where we're asking you to go to the 2020 survival guide on our website, gaslightnationpod.com, and just treat it like your checklist for standing in your power and fighting for our democracy. And that's how we're going to ultimately win. Sarah and I have been bringing you all of this under a microscope. And if we felt that there wasn't a path, if there wasn't hope, why would we have this show? So the fact that we keep showing up again and again for each other, for you, means that we refuse to give up our power, and we're going to stand in our power. And that is how we all win. So go make phone calls, go send texts, go knock on doors safely if you can. Go talk to your family and friends and make sure they have all voted. Okay? Go vote yourself, vote early. All of these things you absolutely must do. And you must do it again and again and again, election cycle after election cycle, because all of us being on autopilot is how we got here. The Republicans have been very proactive and very creative and relentless. And they didn't do this overnight. So we're not going to defeat them overnight. It's going to take time. It's going to take bold moonshots and, running in races that we know we can't win just to create a progressive infrastructure on the ground. So think big, think with your heart, put your heart out there and fight like hell and commit along with us for the rest of your lives to this fight. And those who come after us will stand a much stronger chance. And that's how we win. Just know that we're still doing this Save Our Democracy challenge. We're challenging you to make 1,000 phone calls, send 1,000 texts to get out the vote. If you look at the electoral map, the states that Biden absolutely must win are Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona. We can absolutely and should try for Florida. We can and must absolutely try for Texas. But the states he absolutely must win are Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona, Florida, Texas. But the first ones I listed, especially Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, if those go blue and he wins the states that Hillary won, he ekes through. And even if it's close, they're going to try to challenge the results and do what they can with their far-right Republican judges that have packed the courts. And it's going to be a battle and it's going to be scary. But fight like hell, make calls for Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona, Texas, Florida. Go make those phone calls. Try to make 1,000 by November 3rd. Even make phone calls on November 3rd. Make sure everybody shows up and votes and waits in line as long as they need to.
Yep. I agree. And, I've said this before on this show, if you're listening to us discuss all the ways that they plan to manipulate and steal and lie about this election, it's because we're being honest with you and we want you to understand what's coming. But even if those things happen, remember that transparency is what's needed. And turnout is transparency. Turnout is a visible demonstration of the people's will. And you're seeing that right now. We do not have a mainstream media that accurately expresses the political proclivities of American citizens, the desires of them. We have a gutted local media. We have a media that in many ways wants a second term of Trump, or is being threatened or intimidated or sees this as, it's beyond money. Like I've talked about that before. It's not just about money and clicks and ratings, because you can get those things by discussing the crimes that Trump has committed, particularly topics that interest a wide variety of people across the political spectrum, like Jeffrey Epstein and the fact that, for example, Trump was accused in court of raping a 13-year-old procured by Epstein. They stay away from all those topics, even though they're ratings bonanzas. So there's something much worse going on here, something much darker, that I think has to do with the fact that Trump was immersed for 40 years in the news media, in entertainment, in organized crime, in politics. He was not a neophyte. So you're not going to necessarily get an accurate sense of what is happening to us as a nation from the mainstream media. You're not necessarily going to get it from social media, which is a disinformation minefield. And lately, because of the pandemic, you're not getting the kind of on-the-ground reports of public sentiment that you would normally expect to see during an election cycle, because, people aren't out and about like they usually are. And also, people are frightened. Like we're going through a collective trauma as a nation. And I don't think anyone is, sort of thinking clearly. We're all just basically fighting for our lives, fighting for survival. But nonetheless, that's why turnout is important, is because it lets everybody see where you stand. And if there is a landslide, like, that is leverage. If they try all these tricks, whether it's prolonged court battles, whether it's propaganda tactics like the kind we're seeing right now related to Hunter Biden, all of these October surprises and whatnot, they'll pull out everything they can to stay in power because they need to. If they're not in power, they risk prosecution, they lose their money. We have a crime operation being carried out that's threatened by actual democracy, and they want to take it to the limit, and our job is to stop it. And so a landslide is one form of leverage, particularly in a pandemic when, demonstrations become more difficult. It's harder to do those sorts of public gatherings that are common in situations like this. We haven't really had this kind of situation in the United States, but we do now. But yes, anyway, just please let your voice be heard. Don't be shy about it. This is definitely not the time to be shy.
And tweet at us at Gaslit Nation on Twitter and tell us the calls you're making, the texts you're sending. Tell us how you are talking to voters directly to get out the vote. And from the responses we receive on Twitter, we're going to select 3 people to come on the show in the new year and chat with us about our dreams for taking back our democracy. So you can join this Gaslit Nation's ongoing slumber party and stay in the fight with us. And I want to say to the media, there was this, so Sarah, you were blissfully spared this when you were away on vacation, but there was this really annoying viral video by a CBS reporter, Bo Erickson, who, at a time when it was quickly confirmed that Giuliani and his Russian agent, Ukrainian goon squad, had planted Russian disinformation against Hunter Biden. It was widely confirmed at that point in the media that this was Russian disinformation, that's Hunter Biden's story. Bo Erickson did not get that memo and asked Joe Biden about it. And Joe Biden gave him a gruff response. And Bo Erickson and a colleague at CBS, this woman, Paula, I don't remember her last name, but her first name was trending on Twitter because she tried to say that Biden snapping back or just being gruff with Bo Erickson was how Trump treats reporters. Dear God, it's like this. Like, Trump is a wannabe autocrat who would put you guys in prison if he could. He would blow up the cars of the best investigative journalists among us if he could get away with it, like they have in Ukraine and Russia and elsewhere. And so this false equivalency that helped get us Trump in 2016, the media is indulging in that again. Stop with that nonsense, please. It's like, you white people, like Bo Erickson and Paul at CBS, you white people are safe. You guys are going to get a ratings bonanza if the horror show of the Trump crime family stays in power. But it's the communities of color whose lives you're desperately jeopardizing, including all of those children who are being sex trafficked on the border in this deliberately evil system engineered by Stephen Miller, okay? So that is what is at stake here. I know it's not going to infect you, Paula and Bo, but it's going to infect a lot and destroy a lot of innocent lives out there. So stop it. And one thing, if Bo Erickson wants to be a real journalist instead of this guy seen on TV, one thing he should absolutely do is confront Joe Biden and say, Joe Biden, what are you going to do about Republican voter suppression? What are you going to do about sweeping Republican voter suppression? What do you have to say to Americans that are concerned that their vote isn't going to count? What are you going to do about Amy Coney Barrett getting shoved through and that this might get decided by the Supreme Court? Those are valid questions you should be pushing Joe Biden on, because the danger is that the Democrats are going to forfeit the fight before it even starts. Like, we've seen that again and again, where they capitulate, they pre-surrender. So if Bo Erickson wants to do a public service, if Bo Erickson doesn't want to be a waste of space, if he wants to practice actual journalism, get in Biden's face about that, because that's where Democrats have had a very clear weakness.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And then that's one of the things that, kind of lower on my list in terms of, are we going to have full fascism? But if Biden does win, one of the things that we all need to push for is accountability of all of the crimes committed while in office and investigation of all of the crimes that Trump and his extended network committed in conjunction with the Russian mafia, with an assortment of oligarchs and plutocrats around the world prior to the time that he took office. Because one of the great mysteries of this, as we've spoken about many, many times, is that Trump was embedded in organized crime for decades, yet the institutions that are charged charged with protecting us, had no qualms about letting him have access to classified information, about letting him be in a position of national security, about giving him access to nukes. This is someone who, of course, would fail a standard security clearance test. And this is somebody whose two children, who he illicitly installed in the administration in violation of anti-nepotism laws, also failed their clearances, and in a normal situation, they would have been removed. As I've said, Kushner lied on his security clearance form more than any person in U.S. history in terms of omitting foreign contacts, many of whom, in terms of these contacts, are associated with the Russian mafia. And so that's something that people need to ask Joe Biden about. I mean, if we're going to be having all of these conversations about Hunter Biden, who's a person that honest to God, I don't give a shit about. I wouldn't want to vote for Hunter Biden. If he was running for office, I would be opposed to that. And I honestly think if we rid these industries of influence, politics, media, and so forth, of nepotism, this country would just improve exponentially. We would just be rid of so many of these problems. And yeah, I do think Hunter Biden has been a beneficiary of nepotism in the way that most politicians and rich people's kids are. But the ultimate beneficiaries are obviously Ivanka and Jared, who, came in with criminal ties. Ivanka came in nearly having been convicted of felony fraud, and then went on to abuse their position to, have illicit relationships with Saudi Arabia, Israel, Russia, Qatar, to pay off their debt, to make illegal trademark deals. And, this has barely been investigated. And even now, with Hunter Biden's name just floating through the media, they still will not touch those two. And I have said many times that I feel that Jared Kushner is a bigger national security threat than Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is obviously a severe one. But it's this kind of, hands-off approach. For a couple of years, they looked into it, and then they backed off. And I think, the pushing of Hunter Biden as a central figure in this narrative, which started, all the way back in 2019, is meant to be something that prompts this, to make it seem like any discussion of Ivanka, Don Jr., and Jared Kushner is a whataboutism kind of reaction. So when you bring up the crimes of these adult children who worked for the campaign or for the administration, it seems that it's reacting to the Hunter Biden case instead of a severe threat in its own right. And that is something that reporters should be looking at. That is something that affects our lives as Americans. It was Jared Kushner overseeing the coronavirus crisis, especially in the early months. It was him that was holding back needed medical equipment, supplies for doctors, protective equipment, and was deciding to just let people die. That is something that affects you. Hunter Biden, whatever the hell he's doing or has done, he's not someone in a position of governmental power. He's not somebody abusing it. He is not, evil to the core. We really have a crisis here with Ivanka and Kushner that has not been addressed. And if Trump is removed from office, they all need to be prosecuted and they need to be investigated. And all of that information needs to be made public to the American people. You cannot just skip over it. What they're trying to do, I think, is get the Democrats and get Biden to say children are off limits. Even adult children, they're off limits when you're attacking each other. Let's not talk about that anymore. That does not apply here. That does not apply to people who are being paid by our tax dollars and who are making policies that affect our lives and affect our deaths. So yeah, they need to be investigated. They need to be treated like any other government official that has been engaging in illicit or illegal activity.
Yeah. The Hunter Biden story is 100% a deflection story to protect Ivanka and Jared and Don Jr. and Eric Trump from facing justice for their crimes. It's a deflection story, 100%. It's a false equivalency narrative that they're trying to spin to protect the children in the Trump crime family, because they know that after the father's gone, the pigs of the trough are going to be protected by this Trump dynasty that's going to let them escape regulation and taxes and accountability and just let corruption flourish. And remember, corruption is an industry. And so they're trying to keep the Trump kleptocracy going. Don't fall for it. Every time you see Hunter Biden, immediately switch it in your brain to Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner, Eric Trump, Don Jr. If it weren't for Manhattan DA Cy Vance, like Manhattan DA Cy Vance could have ended all this. He could have prosecuted Ivanka Trump and Don Jr. for defrauding investors in Trump Soho. This could have all ended with Manhattan DA Cy Vance, and it didn't, because the Trump crime family is so good in buying its way out of justice. You had a Trump family lawyer suddenly show up and make a campaign donation to Manhattan DA Cy Vance. So this could have ended a long time ago. NBC could have done its due diligence and looked into the Trump crime family and all of their fraud and all the people they've ripped off, and the fact that they, by their own admission, rely on Russian funding. That means dirty money that's trying to park itself abroad. NBC normalized this crime family, made them seem like genuinely rich, successful people. Turns out, thanks to reporting from the New York Times and now Forbes, building on that, Forbes has ran now, I think, two articles saying that, look, Trump is $1 billion in debt. When you have that much debt, $1 billion in debt, you are a easy mark. You are compromised. To me, my head's gonna explode. So, but just remember, when you see Hunter Biden, just switch it off immediately and think Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner, Don Jr., Eric Trump. That is ultimately what this Hunter Biden smear campaign is about, is protecting the children of the Trump crime family.
Yeah. And I was just thinking to myself how Cy Vance himself, Cy Vance Jr., is yet another nepotism product. He's the son of the former Secretary of State under Jimmy Carter. You know, you also see Mika Brzezinski's father in that administration. Like, so many of the people you see.
Mika Brzezinski, who helped normalize Trump in 2016 and is now fighting for her life now with Joe Scarborough, because they know if Trump gets 4 more years, they might get purged, or they're not going to have an easy time, that's for sure.
It's just one, insular circle of elites installing their children into positions, helping them get into positions. And, he's yet another example. And I wonder, Cy Vance is famous for letting a lot of people off the hook, including Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, and then, Don Jr. and Ivanka. And I wonder if part of it is he just assumes that if you are the child of some sort of, wealthy, prominent East Coast person, then you walk, you get off, you get away from it. It's this whole way of viewing humanity on a hierarchical scale where, people don't have to play by the rules because they've inherited a different set of rules from their parents. And then they go out of their way to be the people who write those rules. That is the purpose of Bill Barr. That was the strategy of Roy Cohn. It was always, it doesn't matter what the law is, it matters who the judge is. And so they form, these networks and nexuses of relationships, that are corrupt to the core. And also, I just like to say, I'm trying to think of another way than fuck you, but honestly, like, fuck you to all the people who were like, oh, Cy Vance is going to save us with the taxes, after they said, Bill Barr will save us and Mueller will save us and a secret Senate report will save us. The reason I say fuck you isn't because you were wrong. It's because you caused endless threats to me and to Andrea and to other journalists who are telling you the truth about these people, who are not trying to get invited to like cocktail parties and who were not working as part-time propagandists for a aspiring autocratic regime. We were telling you who these people were, what their backgrounds were, what they were about, not what they would necessarily do, but what they were likely to do based on precedent. And we were relentlessly threatened for that. And now that we are 2 weeks away from the election, unfortunately, we were right. And the amount of time that you wasted waiting for these false saviors, waiting for somebody like Cyrus Vance Jr. to just kick into gear and go after Trump, like, you are deluded. You have to look at the people who told you this information, whether they're quote unquote legal pundits on TV or anonymous Twitter serial harassers, of which there were many associated with people like Louis Louise Mensch, who sold you these fairy tales. You have to get past that and accept the reality and think about how you were duped because you caused actual harm to me, to my family, to people around me. Like the amount of shit that we had to deal with for months on end because of your delusions, it was a pain in the ass. I'll just put it that way. Nonetheless, we are still here. We are still doing our show. But it's not fun to have your life consistently threatened. So I'm just going to leave it at that because I'm too pissed off. And so Andrea, did you want to go into the courts?
Yeah, there's a lot to go into. So Putin's mass murdering xenophobic regime is still working hard to destroy our country from within. They're doing really well so far, right? They've got their Russian mafia asset in the White House, a walking, talking disinformation machine. You have America with skyrocketing deaths while other countries around the world have the pandemic under control. Trump is literally killing Americans and turning us against each other. And it's horrendous. This is what it is. We're being weakened from within by a Kremlin proxy who's happy to do it because he himself wants to live large like Putin. And there is extraordinary reporting that's just coming out that once again, for the millionth time, confirms all this. You have this great piece in GQ called The Mystery of the Immaculate Concussion. And I'm going to read from it now. He was a senior CIA official tasked with getting tough on Russia. Then, one night in Moscow, Mark Polymeropoulos' life changed forever. He says he was hit with a mysterious weapon, joining dozens of American diplomats and spies who believe they've been targeted with this secret device all over the world, and even at home on U.S. soil. Now, as a CIA investigation points to blame at Russia, the victims are left wondering why so little is being done by the Trump administration. And the piece goes on to explain how Gina Haspel, who is the head of the CIA, very much known as a patriot in the agency, there's reporting in this piece that Haspel is trying to put a lid on this issue because she simply cannot take it to Trump because he will explode on her and anyone who brings him any information on Russia's ongoing attack against America. And some of the explanation includes that Trump likes Putin, wants to be liked by Putin, and wants to be Putin. That's all in there. And Haspel's trying to protect the agency and trying to basically survive until a new administration comes in. She doesn't want to be purged, so she's being very careful which battles she fights. So meanwhile, you have Americans here on U.S. soil getting hit by this technology that has been known to be advanced by the Russians. Those same microwave attacks that happened in China and in Cuba that have left lasting damage. And the targets have included children. This is now happening on U.S. soil. The Russians are so emboldened that they are testing out their fancy dystopian death ray here on us, here at home. So if this can happen to members in government, why couldn't this happen to activists and journalists? Why couldn't this happen to me and Sarah? So understand that this is the beginning. The floodgates are open, and it's time for people in the media and organizations from top down to just confront this reality that we are literally being invaded by Russian aggression because we cannot hold them accountable because that might lead to a purge of patriotic men and women in the CIA. This is as serious as it gets. And it's the start of something. And if this trend continues, my God, we're just going to be a Russian proxy state even more than we already are today. And this is all backed up by reporting out just now in the New York Times. U.S. diplomats and spies battled the Trump administration over suspected attacks. American officials in China, Cuba, and Russia say U.S. agencies are concealing the true extent of the episodes, leaving colleagues vulnerable to hostile actions abroad. And I'm going to read from some of this now. The administration took a softer approach with China. In May 2018, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who was a CIA director during the Cuba events, told lawmakers that the medical details of one American official who had fallen ill in China were, quote, very similar and entirely consistent with the syndrome in Cuba. The administration evacuated more than a dozen federal employees and some of their family members. The State Department soon retreated, labeling what happened in China as, quote, health incidents. While the officers in Cuba were placed on administrative leave for rehabilitation, Those in China initially had to use sick days and unpaid leave, some officers and their lawyers say, and the State Department did not open an investigation into what happened in China. The administration has said little about the events in China and played down the idea that a hostile power could be responsible. But similar episodes have been reported by senior CIA officers who visited the agency's stations overseas, according to 3 current and former officials and others familiar with the events. That includes Moscow, where Mark Polymeropoulos, a CIA officer who helped run clandestine operations in Russia and Europe, experienced what he believes was an attack in December 2017. Mr. Polymeropoulos, who was 48 at the time, suffered severe vertigo in his hotel room in Moscow and later developed debilitating migraine headaches that forced him to retire. The cases involving CIA officers, none of which have been publicly reported, are adding to suspicions that Russia carried out the attacks worldwide. Some senior Russia analysts in the CIA, officials at the State Department, and outside scientists, as well as several of the victims, see Russia as the most likely culprit given its history and weapons that cause brain injuries, and its interest in fracturing Washington's relations with Beijing and Havana. So we're going to link to these 2 must-read stories. Please share this with Glenn Greenwald and the other idiots who pretend to be far left or whatever they pretend to be when they're really just disinformation machines. Share this far and wide. Send this to anybody who's on the fence about voting or voting for Trump.
I want to read a little more from the Julia Ioffe piece, the GQ one, just so people they get what we're dealing with in terms of this weaponry, and that there is a long history of
and that's the GQ piece. Julia Ioffe wrote that for the GQ piece. So there's 2 pieces, GQ and New York Times.
Yeah, so in Ioffe's piece, she writes, as the Cold War progressed, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union raced to find military uses for what came to be called directed energy weapons. American researchers had studied things like beaming words into subjects' heads, great for psychological warfare, while also researching the thermal aspects of microwaves. Packaged in the right way, researchers theorized a microwave weapon could be mounted on a truck where it could cast a beam outward to create an invisible barrier anywhere, anytime, capable of immobilizing any person who got in its range. This research ultimately culminated in the development of a weapon the Pentagon calls an active denial system, or ADS. In a video touting its capabilities, the U.S. military boasts that this highly portable weapon can be attached to a military vehicle and used to direct precise beams of electromagnetic radiation at, say, an armed militant in a crowd or a suspicious person approaching a military checkpoint. The beam would instantaneously produce a sensation of heat on the skin, which would trigger a person's reflex to flee. This summer, a military official inquired about deploying the technology against American protesters who flooded into the streets of Washington, D.C. to protest police brutality. And then it goes on from there, just a brief description of what happens when they were analyzing the effect of this weapon on animals. It says nerves became damaged. The radiation also showed the potential to disturb the sacrosanct blood-brain barrier, and according to the DIA, resulted in the alterations of brain function. The most common symptoms reported in humans who'd been exposed to microwaves for long periods of time sounded familiar: headache, fatigue, perspiration, dizziness, insomnia, depression, anxiety, forgetfulness, and lack of concentration. Soviet researchers found that turning the intensity of the beam up or down could produce differing effects in its target. A target's unique physiology, slightly different curvature of the skull, for example, also determined how this directed energy would affect them. A weapon that created an ever-changing kaleidoscope of neurological symptoms would have a powerful psychological dimension. If everyone's symptoms are all slightly different, victims might question whether they'd all been exposed to the same thing or if they'd been hit at all. And so this was just very striking to me because we are, of course, in the middle of a public health catastrophe that has been made a catastrophe because of the pathological lying of the officials that are supposed to protect our health, that are supposed to be giving us information on how to protect ourselves from a pandemic, that are supposed to be relaying scientific research about how it spreads. Instead, we have a president who tells us to, drink bleach and, like drown it out with ultraviolet raise. We have a president who is threatening the researchers and scientists who are supposed to be handling this. But we also are in a war. And I think that folks don't really accept this because just like they tend to envision fascism as something like tanks come rolling through and the barbed wires fall and there's some sort of obvious decree that we are now a fascist society. This kind of new 21st century digital warfare that also includes new types of technological weapons, like this one being deployed, they're invisible. They're hard to see, and it's hard to trace, and it's hard to find the culprit, and it's hard to prosecute. But this is the kind of threat we're facing. And I stress again, we have a government who wants this kind of technology to be used against American citizens, against Americans who are trying to do their job in a diplomatic or military capacity to protect this country, against protesters. That was something that's suggested. This is terrifying. This is, a step up from the poisoning techniques that we've already seen Russia using flagrantly on foreign soil. We saw the Novichok poisonings in 2018, the lack of response from NATO, the lack of response from the UK, where it killed an innocent passerby. This is very frightening stuff. And, from there, I have some things to say on the handling of coronavirus, but I don't know if you have more to say on this one, Andrea.
Yeah, and it mirrors how the Russians keep using banned nerve agents to kill and weaken their opposition and all the murders they've carried out on British soil. The Russians are emboldened because they keep winning, and the US is occupied right now, and that divides the Western alliance. And people, when they're fractured like this, when they're shocked by this, it's harder to stand up to them. You even see Macron, the president of France, signing on to statements with Putin, normalizing Putin's terrorist regime that's carrying out all these acts. So it's a very scary time, and part of holding Putin's mass murdering xenophobic regime accountable is by fighting like hell to ensure that Biden gets elected. So we've got a lot of darkness to cover on this show. So I think one thing we want to talk about also is Amy Coney Barrett, because if Democrats can't stand up to her and use every mechanism of process available to them, including insisting on calling quorums constantly, just really putting speed bump after speed bump into the Senate process right now. If Democrats cannot stop the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, how the hell are they going to stop Trump from stealing the election? It's the exact same thing. The forced through nomination of Amy Coney Barrett is another attempt of Donald Trump to steal the election. We saw him deliberately purging the U.S. Postal Service, having one of his big donors run it and purge, and deliberately slow down the mail. It's the same type of mechanism. So Democrats, dear God, please, everybody listening, call Chuck Schumer. It's as important as making phone calls to voters. It's as important as listening to the show and staying engaged. Call your senator, and tell them that they absolutely must delay. And they can do that by forcing quorums, by forcing votes. They just need to get creative. In a corporation, if somebody was trying to do a hostile takeover of your corporation, there's so many tricks at your disposal to try to fend that off. So they need to fight like hell. They really absolutely do. And the clip we played at the start of the show was by Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse calling out all the dark money, which is another institutional weakness, right? Citizens United, that has led to this Republican court packing. And that's another reason why we should not be optimistic that Biden's going to squeak through. And I want to remind everybody that Citizens United, that was another major turning point in our nation's history that opened up the floodgates that got us here, all this dark money. You had reports of how Kremlin-linked money was flowing through the GOP in 2016. Well, Citizens United, whose court gave us that? John Roberts gave us Citizens United. It was his court that said, yes, a corporation is a person, and therefore they must have their First Amendment right of freedom of speech, meaning they can spend all the money they want. All that dark money can flow. That's not democracy. All voices are equal, rich and poor. All voices are equal. That's democracy. When the rich have a louder, more powerful voice, that's corporate fascism. John Roberts gave us that. John Roberts also gutted the Voting Rights Act saying, oh, racism's over. What happened then? Nearly 2,000 polling places across the country immediately shut down. And now you have all these long lines across the country in primarily communities of color, people waiting half a day just to vote. This is obscene. In the eyes of the world, we look like a struggling, developing nation. Like, our democracy is in crisis. You have, for the first time ever, the Carter Center is going to be monitoring American elections. They monitor elections in struggling democracies around the world, and they're going to be monitoring our election. That's what John Roberts has done to our country. This is all John Roberts. John Roberts, a Bush appointee, a product of Bush's stolen election in 2000. John Roberts, he is the one that helped give us Trump in a very, very big way. John Roberts and Putin are both equally guilty in leading to the Trump crime family stealing the 2016 election. They set the course for that. And then we have this really troubling Supreme Court decision that just came out, where Republicans in Pennsylvania forced a vote in the Supreme Court where they tried to shut down the right of Pennsylvania voters to have their votes counted, even if their ballots were received a few days after actual election day. And this decision in the Supreme Court was very tight. It was very tight. It was overturned, and John Roberts, the Chief Court Justice, may be concerned about how he'll be remembered in history. In this one moment, I wouldn't give him that credit. He sided with the liberal judges in striking this down. But if Amy Coney Barrett gets on the court, she's going to be as extreme as Kavanaugh, Clarence Thomas, and the others. She's put on the court for that purpose. We have a far-right court that's there on purpose to dismantle our democracy and to allow corporate corruption to flourish. It's corporate fascism that they're going to benefit from. What's really disturbing about this case, as the writer Mark Joseph Stern, who covers the courts for Slate, he points out, 4 conservative justices supported a radical theory that would empower state legislatures to violate election laws and engage in voter suppression with impunity. Only Roberts balked. And what does this ultimately mean? Well, Joshua Douglas, an election law and voting rights professor at the University of Kentucky Rosenberg College of Law, wrote for CNN, the new conservative court could have full power to rule on all election cases under not only the U.S. Constitution, but also all 50 state constitutions, to ensure conservative rulings on all election law cases for this year and beyond. Basically, this latest Pennsylvania case ruling in the Supreme Court opens up the floodgates that, and I keep talking about floodgates because this is what it is, right? Citizens United was a big floodgate and is leading to even bigger floodgates. So what this Supreme Court ruling in Pennsylvania means is that if Amy Coney Barrett gets on the court, there's an entrenched far-right majority on the Supreme Court. John Roberts, who's been wishy-washy, right? Even if he dissents, Amy Coney Barrett puts it over. And what this means is that this far-right, dark money-funded court could then overrule the voting rights protected in state constitutions across our country. So as we're always saying on Gaslit Nation, fight like hell in your state, protect your own backyard, make your state bright blue and functioning. But guess what? This far-right Supreme Court can come after you and take away your voting rights now. This is where the wind is blowing. So if you want to protect the right to vote where you live, if you want to protect your constitutionally protected, because every state has a state constitution, and the vast majority, I think like 49 out of 50 of the state constitutions protect your right to vote. If you do not want the Supreme Court to cancel that out and to rule in favor of some rabid Republicans in your state that are dark money funded, we need to do everything humanly possible to stop Amy Coney Barrett from getting on the Supreme Court. And that is possible if Democrats fight like hell, fight creatively, and they use every procedural tool to delay this vote. We must delay it to at least until after the election, because if there is a blue wave, and there could very well be a blue wave, if there is a blue wave, and let's say Mark Kelly in Arizona wins his race against the very unpopular McSally, Mark Kelly gets seated right away in the Senate. And if Trump is voted out, the optics are going to look horrendous. It's going to be a huge disgrace against Amy Coney Barrett. Amy Coney Barrett, who herself is on record in giving an interview saying that Obama did not have the right to have Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court in an election year. She's on record saying that. And now here she is trying to weasel her way through on the Supreme Court. This is crisis time. Amy Coney Barrett getting onto the Supreme Court is going to be as devastating to our democracy as Citizens United has been and as the gutting of the Voting Rights Act has been. It's just another floodgate that's opening to drown out our democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to reiterate that, you need to talk about the stakes of our political crisis in plain terms. Early, maybe a year ago, Andrea said, whoever the Democratic candidate is going to be, they will be running against the Russian mafia. And that remains true. And we've been saying from the start that the goal of the GOP is to create a one-party state, an autocracy that is married to organized crime, that is married to organized crime in the West, and that is married to organized crime in Russia, and to, of course, just transnational organized crime. As we said many times, this is a transnational crime syndicate masquerading as a government. And you need to look at any kind of political interaction, including something like a Supreme Court hearing, including the appointment of a new judge, things we have had before, in a different light, as a mechanism in the aim of fulfilling that long-term goal and changing permanently the direction of our country. And I don't necessarily mean permanently, but for a long time, for the duration, of our natural lives, most likely, should they succeed. So you need to be incredibly creative in fighting back against that. You need to be vigilant and you need to be honest. And, one story to sort of, I think, close us out that I saw recently that brings this home is the threats against Dr. Fauci, who now has to have armed security wherever he goes because he's being threatened by violence, in part because, of course, Trump, as the president, has been encouraging that. And so CBS interviewed him about this, and he says, it's really a magnitude different now because of the anger. As much as people inappropriately, I think, make me somewhat of a hero, and I'm not a hero, I'm just doing my job, there are people who get really angry at thinking I'm interfering with their life because I'm pushing a public health agenda. It's tough. Serious threats against me, against my wife, against my daughters. I mean, really. Is this the United States of America? And to which I'm like, yes, welcome to the club. Like, I don't want you in this club. I don't want you to get threatened. I don't want anybody to get threatened. The reality is, however, that for the last 4 years, these types of threats have been part of so many people's lives, whether it's the aforementioned political opponents of Trump, people who ran against him, people from prior administration, against journalists, against public servants. Almost everybody who was testifying at the impeachment hearings had been threatened. Many of them had to have armed security as well, against judges, against juries, against protesters, against voters, against organized citizens. This is a mafia state. This is what a mafia state looks like. This is what it feels like to live in a mafia state. And for the US, we have the added twist of our mafia state being led by a president whose loyalty, any loyalty he has beyond just interest in money and power, is to another country, is to Russia, which makes us profoundly disposable. And so here you have the culmination of that. You have the person who is in charge of advising us on how to combat a pandemic that has already killed over 220,000 Americans, having their own life threatened with physical violence. This is a culture of death. We are fighting an apocalyptic death cult. And I know that this sounds, very grim, very dire, but the only answer to that is you fight back. There's no other choice. You fight back with everything you've got. You look for solutions that maybe haven't been tried before. You have to think outside of the box. You've got to throw protocol out the window. You've got to stop tiptoeing around this, not calling it what it is. This is very frightening stuff. But honestly, if you speak about about it plainly, if you identify and name the threat, then it is a lot easier to combat it. And it's a lot easier to get people together, to work and fight it. And I actually think that the average American citizen understands this threat better than, the media or officials. And if those people in the media and officials do understand it, they're refusing to let on. They don't want to seem alarmist or hysterical. But we could see this happening with our own eyes. And when we're on like the, 100th public official who's come forward and said, yes, this administration and its followers have threatened my life because I've tried to do my job, that is a very clear-cut pattern. And we're on year 4 of that pattern. And if we enter term 2 of that pattern, the threats are going to be more severe. The tactics are going to be more brutal. And we have to do everything we can to stop that. And I don't necessarily have faith in any good outcome. I don't think we'll necessarily see some rosy ending, but I do have faith in American people fighting back. We've already seen it. We've seen it with the protesters. We've seen it with voters. We've seen it with people speaking out. We've seen it with people who aren't giving up on each other. They aren't giving up on their country. They aren't giving up on themselves. So please just take that defiance and take that determination and hang on to it for the months to come, because you're going to need it.
And we have slowed them down, because things would be a lot worse if we didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to point out this just in reporting from Josh Jamerson, a national politics reporter for the Wall Street Journal, points out this horrendous story. Several lawmakers say they were denied entry to U.S. Postal Service facilities where they had been routinely permitted, with 14 days to go in an election where mail-in ballots are playing a crucial role. They are trying everything. They're throwing everything in the kitchen sink at stealing this election. But what do? We're defiant in response. So go to the Gaslit Nation 2020 Survival Guide. Go there, treat it as your checklist, make your phone calls, send your texts, and for the love of God, bombard your senator every day with phone calls saying, do everything in your power to slow this down. Because if Amy Coney Barrett is on the Supreme Court, that's as bad as Citizens United and the Voting Rights Act being gutted. It's destruction of our democracy. And in tribute to that, here is Keith Olbermann when he had his own show on MSNBC back in 2010, talking about the Citizens United ruling and what it meant for our democracy. And this is just a reminder of where we're headed if we don't stop this.
Finally tonight, as promised, a special comment on the Supreme Court's ruling today in the case Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission. On the cold morning of Friday, March 6, 1857, a very old man who was born just 8 months and 13 days after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, a man who was married to the sister of the man who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, a man who was enlightened enough to have freed his own slaves and given pensions to the ones who had become too old to work, read aloud in a reed-thin voice from a very long handwritten document. In it, he ruled on a legal case involving a slave brought by his owner to live in a free state, yet to remain a slave. The slave sought his freedom and sued, and looking back over legal precedent and the Constitution and the America in which it was created, this judge ruled that no black man could ever be considered an actual citizen of the United States. They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far unfit that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. The case, of course, was Dred Scott. The old man was the 5th Chief Justice of the United States of America, Roger Brooke Taney. The outcome, he believed, would be to remove the burning question of abolition of slavery from the political arena for once and for all. The outcome, in fact, was the Civil War. No American ever made a single bigger misjudgment. No American ever carried the responsibility for the deaths and suffering of more Americans on his shoulders. No American was ever more quickly vilified. Within 4 years, Chief Justice Taney's rulings were being ignored in the South and the North. Within 5, President Lincoln, at minimum, contemplated arresting him. Within 7, he died in poverty while still Chief Justice. Within 8, Congress had voted to not place a bust of him alongside those of the other former Chief Justices. But good news tonight, Roger B. Taney is off the hook. Today, the Supreme Court of Chief Justice John Roberts, in a decision that might actually have more dire implications than Dred Scott v. Sanford, declared that because of the alchemy of its 19th century predecessors in deciding that corporations had all the rights of people Any restrictions on how these corporate beings spend their money on political advertising are unconstitutional. In short, the First Amendment, free speech for persons, which went into effect in 1791, applies to corporations, which were not recognized as the equivalents of persons until 1886. In short, there are now no checks on the ability of corporations or unions or other giant aggregations of power to decide our elections. None.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
We want to encourage you to donate to your local food bank, which is experiencing a spike in demand. We also encourage you to donate to Direct Relief at directrelief.org, which is supplying much-needed protective gear to first responders working on the front lines in the U.S., China, and other hard-hit parts of the world.
We encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Syria. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kensier and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It keeps us going. And also subscribe to us on YouTube.
Our production managers are Nicholas Torres and Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon exclusive content is edited by Carlin Daigle.
Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle.
Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish.
Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon: Laurel B.,
Stephanie Brandt, MD,
Mark Snaggs Alexander,
Rachel Winder,
Stephanie K. Reasoner,
T.R. Dunstan,
John Millett,
Michael Finn,
Lacey W. Brightside Counseling,
David East,
Shannon Nacy,
Ida,
Chris Fellow,
Dodie Pop,
Kristen Bredimus,
Suzanne McFadden,
Gabriel R.,
Ben Wheaton,
Amy Timon,
Susan L. Powell,
Michelle Swearingen,
Rich Holcomb,
Sean McDonald,
Jeremy Thompson,
Thomas Scheibe,
Julie Matthews,
Mark,
Barbara Kittredge,
Ripon Rowe,
Matthew Womack,
Sean Berg,
Daniel Passaretti,
Kristen Custer,
Benjamin Galuza,
Kai Gillis,
Toby,
Sharon Hattrick,
Keith Galtshock,
William Barry Reeves,
Janet Robinson,
John Atrix,
Richard Smith,
Emmy,
Kevin Gannon,
Sandra Kalnin,
Michael Steiniff,
Oliver Ash,
Ren,
Kat Cooper,
Katie Masuris,
John Laughlin,
Jeff Thompson,
Evan Rosemore,
Ray Alba,
Leo Chalupa,
Carol Goldstad,
Michael Wooldridge,
Greg Kreimer,
Fontaine Carpenter,
Jason Benke,
Marcus J. Trent,
Joe Darcy,
Ann Marshall,
wait, I lost my place. Sorry. Victoria Nordgren,
Solomon Hikes,
George Hughes,
Christine Morgan,
D.L. Singfield,
Matt Perez,
Nicole Spear,
Kelly Ranson,
Brian Tajudin,
Gustav Halsby,
Christy Vitale,
Adam Levine,
Maureen Murphy,
Michelle Dash,
Jens Eilstrup Rasmussen,
Yawns, Zachary Lemon,
Dorothy Komarick,
Victoria Olson,
Alabama,
Jason Rita,
Margaret Moe,
Z. White,
Rich Craw,
Alan Liu,
Brian Collins,
Lisa LaFlame,
Catherine Anderson Karina,
Lawrence Graham,
Mike Tripico,
Diana Gallagher,
John Ripley,
Ethan Mann,
Jennifer Slavic,
Rhonda White,
Piet Itzma,
David Porter,
Kate Cotton,
Lorraine W. Todd,
Lynn Schneider,
Kevin M. Garnett,
Jared Lombardo,
Karen Humphreys,
Ann Marshall,
Irina Guardia,
Eric Kaplan,
Sonia Bogdanovic.
Tanya Chalupa.
Thank you all for your support. We could not make this show without you.
Yes, thank you.